Hi, I'm Deborah Mobies from Whipstitch, and in previous episodes of the How to Quilt video series, I may have mentioned how much I like optical illusion quilt blocks. Card Trick is a traditional optical illusion quilt block that creates the effect of 4 interlaced squares of fabric set on the diagonal, all made from half and quarter square triangles. That's what we are building on this episode of How to Quilt. One of the things that really draws me to optical illusion blocks is that I appreciate the illusion as a viewer, as someone looking at a quilt like a piece of art. I really appreciate the way that the fabrics create this three-dimensional effect on the finished quilt. But I also like, as someone who sews, I like thinking about sort of the behind the scenes, the meta of the quilt. This idea that we can work in a design across the seam line to make something that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So earlier in the How to Quilt video series, we made the lattice quilt block and created the illusion that we had strips of fabric interwoven in our 12-inch square. In this quilt block, Card Trick, we are going to use triangles to create the illusion that we have 4 interwoven cards, almost like we're holding a hand of poker in front of us. And the way that those fabrics work across the seam lines can add visual interest and even challenge to the construction of the block. As with our other blocks for the How to Quilt video series, with our pieces already cut according to our pattern. So I have 5 different fabrics. I have A, C, D, and G. And then I have fabric E, which is really a background fabric. I'm going to work with my 5.5-inch squares first. So I'm going to set the smaller ones aside. And I'm taking each of these 5.5-inch squares and I am dividing it in half along the diagonal. So if you look at your ruler here, whatever size ruler you have, is going to have a 60, a 45, and a 30-degree angle line included in the ruler. And it really does make cutting these triangles a lot simpler. For our purposes, we're working with 45-degree angle because we're cutting a square, which is 90 degrees, in half. And so I can line that 45 up with any of my straight edges and then draw down to the corner to verify that I'm cutting accurately on the 45. And then we do pinky on the mat, then we cut in the same way as always to divide those triangles so that we have 2 triangles from each fabric. For this fabric, my sort of background E fabric, I can cut both at the same time provided that I keep my raw edges even. So now I have 4 of these, and we repeat until all of the triangles are cut. It does beg the question, since we're working with squares and dividing them into triangles, why we don't use some of the shortcuts that we have worked on earlier in the How to Quilt video series. So for example, when we made our pinwheel quilt block, we made multiples of our half square triangles at the same time, broke them apart, and then installed them into our block. When we made our Ohio Star, we made multiples of our quarter square triangles at the same time and then installed them into our block. However, when you look at the design of this Card Trick quilt block, you'll notice that every individual unit is unique. The combination of colors in the triangles in each of our quarter square triangles is different. There aren't even any repeats in the half square triangles because of the way the illusion is built. So rather than using any shortcuts in this block, we're actually dividing our squares into triangles first and then putting them back together. This allows us to reduce waste when we're only making a single block. If you upgrade to How to Quilt Premium, you'll see that because we're making multiple blocks, we can use those shortcuts. And so there's a different pattern waiting there for you for the whole quilt. But for this block, when we're only making one, and every separate unit is unique, the most efficient thing to do is to break our squares into triangles and put them back together. I'm going to begin with all 4 of my E fabric, my background fabric, and then 1 of each of the other fabrics to make the half square triangles that form the corners of the card trick block. These get set aside. I'm just working with these guys. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. With each of my fabrics, I'll place them right sides together along this diagonal, take it to the machine and stitch. Unlike our shortcut half square triangles, with these, we're sewing existing triangles. So I want you to think through what happens to this point under the needle. I've got my needle down, and I'm going to place the edge of my fabric up against the presser foot. Can you see that the needle then is up against the edge of the fabric, but not at the point? We're not sewing the tip. We're sewing a 1/4 inch seam, so we're a 1/4 inch from this edge when we begin to sew. A little chain stitching can allow us to sew the rest. And then to the iron with our sort of half square triangle bunting here. We're going to snip them apart before we press them open. Keep in mind, for both the half square triangles and the 1/4 square triangles, that by definition, everything cut on that diagonal is cut on the bias. Bias is such an important term, both in garment sewing and in quilting, because anything cut on that 45-degree angle, the warp and the weft, we've turned it on its side and it's a lot more flexible. Flexibility in quilting can often lead to distortion. And for the illusion of this quilt block to really work and be the most optically powerful, we want those 45-degree seam lines as crisp and straight as we can get them. The easiest way to do that is to avoid any distortion in the bias line when we cut these pieces. So handling them gently and utilizing spray stabilizer really goes a long way to getting the most successful block you can get. Back at the cutting table, I'm ready to trim these up. At this stage, we are going to take our half square triangles and our 6.5 inch ruler, and we're going to trim these down to 4.5 inches. So right now they measure 5 inches, and you'll see I've still got that 45-degree angle there. I'm going to trim this up, keeping my corners anchored, rotate, and then I come, boop, 4.5, whoopsie, and stabilize. I appreciate that this seems like a lot of trimming. Keep in mind that the triangles that we cut weren't only for these half square triangles, they are also for our 1/4 square triangles. And in order to have the least amount of waste, the triangles are a little bigger than necessary for these half square triangles, but they won't be bigger than necessary for the 1/4 square triangles. Now these can be set aside and we can start working with our smaller squares. These are saved for later. These are going to be combined with our 1/4 square triangles. Each of these gets cut along the diagonal again, and that 45-degree line there on the 6.5 inch ruler serves the same purpose. These smaller triangles are going to be used to form our 1/4 square triangles. To do that, we're not going to combine them along the bias edge. We're actually going to be combining the straight edges in order to make the units that we need. So we'll take one of each of these, and set it aside. Combined with our 4 background pieces. And notice, again, I'm not combining on the diagonal. I'm combining on the right angle to make these triangles. That leaves us with 4 half quarter square triangles, if you follow, because each of these, if it were a complete square, we'd have a quarter square triangle, but we've only got the lower portion here. And then we have the remaining half triangles from our 5.5 inch squares that we're going to pair according to the diagram and the pattern with the correct matches. Once these are paired up, we take them to the sewing machine and we stitch them together into our finished quarter square triangles. What I want to pay attention to is this seam line here lining up with the point in this triangle. You'll notice, because these are triangles and there are bias edges involved, and these started as 4-inch triangles that we combined into our quarter square triangles, that they're not exactly the same size. But that's all right. We've intentionally sized these. The pattern is written in a way so that you've got the margin for trimming. What I do want to pay attention to, however, is this line matching up with the point in this triangle. I can do that with my ruler by aligning the lower edge and then the seam line so that any inch mark goes through the seam line and the point in the lower triangle. And then I can pin in place. Back at the cutting table, we get the chance to trim these up. And I know I've said before that I think trimming can be sort of tedious, but you know, what if we think of it as a privilege, right? Like, we've made these blocks just slightly oversized so that we can hit our target size dead on. I've got my 6.5 inch ruler. That diagonal line between the quarter square side and the half square side, boom, lands right there. And you can see they come in right around 5 inches, which is a lot of margin. So our target size is 4.5 inches because it's a 3x3 grid with a 12-inch finished block. And I want the center point of my unit to be the center of that 4.5 inches. So again, finished versus unfinished. My total block is 12 inches finished. That's 12.5 inches unfinished. Each unit in my 3x3 grid is 4.5 inches unfinished. So in the block, it'll be 4 inches. So halfway, the center point is 2 inches, which is marked here on my ruler. So if I align that 2-inch mark right there with the intersection, then I can start to trim and get my unit down to the size I want it to be. I rotate, and then again, I line that 2 inches up. And when that 2-inch mark comes, boop, 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 right there at that intersection, my edge is at 4.5. Do you see how the point of this triangle intersects with this edge where I'll trim it here? So that when it's installed in the block, all of my triangles remain triangles. Let's do that one more time for the purposes of demonstration. There's my diagonal line. And if you feel like this seam goes off too far, go back to the iron and tug on the seam there to see if you can get it to align better. So the point of that 2 inches, it's actually 2 1/4, 1, 2 1/4 over, because again, I'm including a 1/4 inch seam allowance all around. The ruler's doing that work for me, but if you don't have a ruler like this, you're going to measure from the edge over 1, 2 1/4 to that center point before we trim. And then rotate. And then 4 1/2 is on this side, and 1, 2 1/4 is on this side, and then we trim again. Next we have the remaining 4 half triangles from the smaller squares. What do we do with those, Deborah? Well, here's a diagram. I'm going to rotate each one around so that here's our apex and there's our hypotenuse. Oh, geometry coming back to get us. I'm going to arrange them according to the diagram in your pattern. Placement really does matter here because all of these have to combine to make our optical illusion. We'll combine these two and then these two to make a 1/4 square triangle. You can see now why people like the shorter versions, because this is a lot of steps and seams for a single unit in our block. And we wouldn't want to do this over and over and over and over again when we know we're making identical units. But this is a unique unit. It's the only one. It's dead center of our block. And we want to get perfect results. And then when you come back, look at that beautiful intersecting seam right at the center. That is literally and figuratively the heart of this optical illusion block. I'm trimming this block in exactly the same way. As the other 1/4 square triangle blocks, which this is. Comes in right at that 4 1/2 like we want. All right, I've got my 1/4 square triangles, my half square triangles, and my center unit. Now it's time to refer to the graphic on the last page of this pattern and start laying it out. At this stage, we're assembling the finished block. And I want you to take a moment to step back. Look at the units that we're talking about. This is a 9 patch. It's just like our 9 patch. It's a 3 across, 3 up and down, 3 by 3 grid. Each of our units is unique, but it still functions in the same way. We still are going to sew our rows, followed by connecting our rows to one another. And I want you to consider at this stage in your development in quilting, I want you to consider how that can inspire you to think through creating different shapes with your quilting that maybe you didn't consider before. So I'll begin with my half square triangles, and they all have the colored fabric facing toward the center and then the background fabric facing out. Around the center. And then I use my 1/4 square triangles to complete the look of the block with the background fabric at the edge and then matching fabrics lining up. And you can start to see, ta-da, how that comes together. The orientation on these pieces here is super important. I made an entire set where they were reversed. So see these two units here? Right? They look the same, but they're actually opposite. But if I put this unit in and this unit here, we don't get the optical illusion. So let's swap these out and show you what happens. Like, it's just not ever gonna work if we make that mistake. So the orientation of those fabrics matters a lot. So if you get these two guys reversed, you can see the difference. I mean, there's no way around it. You just gotta go back and make the unit over. It wasn't super fun, but the payoff is so huge when you lay it all out and get that finished look, right? And now, quiz time. What do we do? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then join our rows. And there's the finished block. We can use our 12.5-inch ruler to trim it up, and when we do that, you'll see there's a corner and there's a corner, and do you see this diagonal line? It should go right through that intersection. There's a 6-inch mark there, dead center of the block. So if you lean toward wanting things to be just so, you can get there using this ruler and square everything up so it'll sit in the quilt exactly right. Very satisfying card trick block. Card trick is such a fun block to do. It's a great way to play with fabric, play with color, and it's a great way to start thinking about not just the two-dimensional, the flat effect of the quilt blocks that we're sewing, but about the impact that the quilt will have once it's a three-dimensional object out in the world. Now that we're finished with card trick, we're ready to move on to building rectangles and squares together into triangles of a different shape, not right triangles anymore, in the next episode when we make flying geese.